One thing the Xeno series is definitely known for is its copious references to various world religions. Today, I'm just going to talk about two relatively minor ones that I only recently found out about, so you might not know yourself. The first is from Xenoblade 1, and is just about the name of Alchemoth, so that doesn't really have any spoilers, but I do have an aside after that that involves a bit of late game spoilers, so we'll get to that when we get to that. And then the second is from Xenogears, which does involve major spoilers, so I'll just give you a timestamp in the description that gives you chapters so you can skip the things. Yeah. And so we begin with Alchemoth, a name that it turns out has actually been a mistranslation for the past 12 years that I only just realized. This is not a Balasarda situation like from my X-Blade Team video, where the Japanese developers of the game mistranslated something into their language, and then obviously by the time it got put into English, the reference was completely lost. This is a much more straightforward case of typical localization mistranslation, where they just didn't catch the reference and translated it as Alchemoth when it's actually supposed to be Akamoth. The Japanese name is Akamoto, which is very obviously just a transliteration of Akamoth into Japanese. I'm not sure where they got the L from in the localization, but this is a very obscure concept that they're referencing, so I don't begrudge them not getting the reference. I just don't know where they got the L from. I would have figured that if they mistranslated it, it would have been something other than inventing a sound that isn't there in Japanese, or the original name. So what exactly is Akamoth? I am not going to go remotely in depth on this because that involves explaining Gnosticism, which is something extremely out of my wheelhouse, and something extremely complicated because it's a collection of 2,000-year-old religious traditions that arguably aren't practiced at all in any form in the present day, and was only given that name a few hundred years ago. In short, the set of beliefs that later scholars would refer to as Gnosticism originated in the 1st century CE among various Jewish and early Christian sects. Obviously, 1st century CE, Jesus had just died, Judaism and Christianity had not completely diverged yet and wouldn't still for a time, so it makes sense that in this relatively volatile time, big paradigm shifts among religion, mingling of different ideas, that certain concepts and things would also come into being around that sort of time that wouldn't necessarily be practiced in the modern day for one reason or another. There was never a specific religion or denomination just called Gnosticism at any point in history, and obviously like any other religion, the beliefs changed over time, but in general, the Gnostic traditions focused more around the accumulation of spiritual knowledge, which is gnosis in Greek, hence the name, and the thing from Xenosaga, and tended to reject more orthodox teachings and texts. They also tended to view the material world as tainted, and believed in two divine powers instead of just one like in most Abrahamic religions. In this case, there was a greater, more hidden, truly supreme god, and also a lesser, weaker god that was responsible for creating the evil material world. This lesser god is sometimes referred to as the Demiurge or Yaldabaoth in various traditions, so that's where that name comes from, and you kind of get the reference now. And the true god was sometimes referred to as the Monad. That's where Monado comes from. Even in the Xeno game that wasn't originally written to be a Xeno game, there's still plenty of Gnostic references. They cannot help themselves. In this case, the most important Gnostic concept is Sophia, the name you might recognize if you've played Xenogears, because that's a big piece of the Gnostic references in that. In short, Sophia is one of the emanations of the true god, usually the final and the lowest one, because she was the one that was involved in the creation of the Demiurge, which created the evil material world. She's also sometimes associated with the Holy Spirit from the Christian Trinity, and a bunch of different things. She's also just supposed to be a feminine aspect of God. Basically, a bunch of different traditions don't all necessarily agree on the same things for the same ideas, concepts, or beings or whatever, but the important thing is that the Hebrew name for Sophia, when translated into Greek, is Akamoth, and that's what the city was supposed to reference. This reference is a reference, but it doesn't necessarily have any thematic connection. I can't find any reasonable way to connect Alchemoth or the High Endia race or anything like that to the concept of Sophia or the Akamoth in Gnosticism. I think it's just an example of Xeno taking a reference from a thing that it tends to take references from and naming something after that because it sounds cool. They have done this before. Some of the cities in Xenogears were named after months in the Hebrew calendar for literally no reason, and somehow one of them was mistranslated as Thames, so it sounded like they made a joke where the boat city was named after a river, but it was actually just supposed to be a month in the Hebrew calendar. But I'm getting away from myself here. Now, the funny thing about me only realizing this reference within the past week, that I probably shouldn't be mentioning because it makes me look bad, is that, yes, this was a mistranslated name, but the mistranslation was adding one letter that shouldn't be there. Not necessarily a big deal. Most reasonable people should still be able to catch the reference when that's the only difference. I, however, am stupid. Now, obviously, not knowing what Achamoth is a fairly reasonable thing, because while yes, Xeno likes to reference Gnosticism, Sophia is the most commonly used name for that concept in the present day. So not even knowing that Achamoth exists is a thing, but I only saw the name Achamoth and made the connection when I was reading through one of the little lore bios on a demon in SMT5. That's the only reason I know this, and the only reason this video exists. So play SMT5. It's not a Xeno game, it's not remotely like a Xeno game, but it's a good JRPG. Atlas, please sponsor me. I like money. And now, just an aside that doesn't really have anything to do with this video, spoilers up through Mechanic's core. While we're talking about the capitals of Titans, because let's be real, the High Antia Empire doesn't exist anymore, but Alchemoth is the closest thing to a capital Bionis has, also located in roughly the same place as Agnirtha. Let's just talk about Agnirtha's name, because this makes less sense. Alchemoth, it's just named after a thing from Gnosticism. It doesn't have any thematic dissonance or anything, it just doesn't have any thematic connections. It's just a cool sounding name, drawing reference from something that Xeno likes to reference. No big deal there. Agnirtha is the combination of the Sanskrit words Agni and Ratha. Ratha is a type of ancient chariot. Agni means fire, and is also the name of a Hindu god. So this is either Fire Chariot or Agni's Chariot. Okay, cool. That makes no sense, because there's an actual historical figure named Agni in the history of Xenoblade 1, who was a giant from Bionis. I don't know why the capital of Mechonis was named after him, or had the same name as him for some coincidental reason, because Agni's Chariot being the name of Prison Island, the place where Zanza pilots the Bionis from, that would make sense. It being the place where Mainith lived and was worshipped, and presumably where she piloted the Mechonis from, makes less sense, but what are you gonna do? And so we arrive at the Gears thing, and this is going to be a lot shorter because it doesn't require nearly as much explanation. This is related to the character Miang, who I've talked about extensively in the past, so this is just going to do with the reference in her name. Something that's fairly common knowledge among Gears fans is that Miang's first name is in fact another mistranslation. It's supposed to be Maya, M-Y-Y-A-H, which accentuates her connection to Ellie, as Ellie's full name is Elehaym, E-L-E-H-A-Y-Y-M, which when you get it backwards is Maya Ele, which according to Perfect Works means Maya exists here. What I didn't realize is that her last name is also a reference to something, and this is another greater scope religious reference as opposed to just connecting back to something within Xenogears. Hawa is the Hebrew name for the biblical figure Eve, the first woman, the mother of humanity. Extremely appropriate because her, combined with Ellie, is the mother of all humanity on the Xenogears planet. So, naming her after Eve is an extremely obvious thing to do, and I'm very annoyed that I didn't realize that. But one last thing that I want to talk about is specifically which language Hawa is supposed to be written in. Because, obviously, Eve, what we have in English, comes from Latin via Greek. The old Hebrew pronunciation of that name was Hawa, or something similar to Hawa. I believe the W is pronounced more like a V in modern Hebrew, but a lot of other languages also use variations on Hawa instead of variations on Eve. While the English text in Perfect Works has a lot of very questionable typos, like spelling Bart's name Bartholomew, forgetting the U in Sigurd's name, and a lot of other things, Miang's name, or Maya's name technically, is written in the Latin alphabet in the Japanese version of Perfect Works. In there, Hawa is spelled H-A-W-W-A. That is, barring an accent over the A, the exact same spelling that Eve, Hawa, has in modern Romanized Arabic. So if that was intentional, and it wasn't just a quirky translation thing of the Hebrew, then this might be one of very, very few references to Islam in Xeno, a series which takes a lot of inspiration from various Abrahamic religions, but mostly focuses on Judaism, Christianity, and various Gnostic traditions, so it's nice to see a reference to a thing that isn't referenced a lot by Xeno, even if it was unintentional. That's all I've got for today. Until next video, this is Luxon, signing off.